With bees dying at record rates, these beekeepers are protesting against German chemicals giant Bayer and its insecticides.
We're the victims. We provide a huge service to society. Our bees pollinate food crops, and this is the thanks we get.
For decades, studies around the world have highlighted the dangers of certain insecticides, something Bayer was keen to hush up.
They wanted to keep it secret. They didn't want to publicize something which would be damaging for the company.
The aim was to stop the debate so they could carry on making money.
These insecticides, known as neonicotinoids, have earned billions for the company. A case of placing earnings over ethics.
What isn't normal is breaking the law, concealing facts.
How influential is the Bayer Group? And did the authorities fail to exercise proper oversight? Breisgau in southwest Germany is a fertile region and home to plenty of canola and cornfields. Christoph Koch runs a bee farm here. He's passionate about what he does. His bees are like part of the family. He'd rarely experienced any problems with pesticides until one spring day 12 years ago. A new pest had appeared in the Rhine Valley and was threatening to devastate the cornfields. To save the harvest, the authorities allowed the large-scale use of neonicotinoids, or neonics as they're also known.
I could see the farmer sowing his corn, and from one moment to the next, the bees stopped flying. It was perfect weather. The bees were out foraging. Everything was wonderful. But as the farmer sowed his seed, everything stopped. All the bees in the air disappeared.
The insecticide the seeds had been treated with resulted in a toxic dust cloud that killed 12,000 bee colonies in the region. More than 500 million bees suffered an agonizing death.
It was the world's worst case of bee poisoning by legal means since bee conservation began. It was very frustrating and very emotional. It really got me down. It got so bad that I couldn't drive over to the beehives anymore. Every time I got near, I was met by the stench of decomposing bees. I just couldn't handle it anymore.
During planting, some of the red pesticide coating the corn seeds rubbed off and was released into the environment.
So what's that was sown?
Yes, corn seeds dressed with insecticide.
And what happened?
You see this red dust? That's insecticide residue that is rubbed off the seeds, and that was released into the air during planting.
And the bees died instantly.
Those that passed through the dust cloud, yes. But the worst bit was that the dust settled on flowering plants, so the remaining bees then gathered contaminated pollen.
Rather than being sprayed onto crops like traditional pesticides, neonics are often applied in the form of a seed dressing. The seed coated with insecticide is then drilled into the ground using a seed planter. The toxins are effective from the root to the entire plant as it grows, making it immune to pests both in the ground and the field. The state of Baden-Württemberg investigated what had gone wrong in Breisgau. To the beekeepers' amazement, blame was placed on the mechanical seed planters. The Agriculture Ministry echoed Bayer's official line, saying that had the seeds been sown correctly, everything would have been fine. Neonics were nevertheless banned for use on corn in Germany, though still permitted for other crops. Bayer offered 2.2 million euros in fast-track aid, but only on one condition for the beekeepers.
In return, I shall cede all existing and future claims to compensation to the state of Baden-Württemberg.
The investigator, the government of Baden-Württemberg, had suddenly become the mediator. The offer from Bayer was actually made via the Agriculture Department.
Bayer and the state of Baden-Württemberg wanted to buy their way out of this. It was touted as emergency aid for the beekeepers, but they were just covering themselves. There was a real push to settle the matter quickly. They knew the bees had been poisoned. Otherwise, it would have taken a lot longer to get the money.
Many of the beekeepers accepted the compensation, and Bayer was left alone. The ban on neonicotinoids in corn wasn't a problem, as they were still approved for many other crops. Between 1992 and 2017, around 3,700 tons of the agent were sold in Germany alone. Bayer and other manufacturers like Syngenta supplied various neonicotinoids to more than 100 countries, earning billions of euros. Scientists accuse the producers of making money at the expense of the environment. Because studies show that neonicotinoids actually impact entire ecosystems. Dutch toxicologist Henk Tennekes has spent years studying the substances sold by companies like Bayer. He believes neonicotinoids are the most toxic insecticides ever produced. We met Tennekes at a clinic in the Netherlands. Even though he was undergoing treatment for pneumonia when we saw him late last year, he agreed to speak to us.
Neonicotinoids are water-soluble and relatively mobile in the ground. So when it rains, they are easily washed into the groundwater and runoff water. This means they affect the whole environment and are also absorbed by wildflowers and plants via their roots. The entire landscape becomes toxic for insects. So it's fair to assume that this will result in mass insect deaths. And if the insects disappear, the ecosystem collapses. That's why this is an ecological Armageddon. We are destroying the whole of nature.
Henk Tennekes believes that neonics are the main cause of insect deaths around the world, and that via the food chain, they're also responsible for the decline in the population of birds, reptiles, and amphibians. And there's evidence that they're harmful to humans too. So why are these insecticides still being sold? In 2018, the European Union did at least ban 3 of the 5 neonicotinoids because of the threat to bees. But France had already banned one product containing the toxins back in 1999. It took 19 years for the EU to catch up. So why did the French authorities act so much earlier? In Paris, we meet scientist Jean-Marc Bonmatin and beekeeper Henri Clement. They helped instigate the 1999 ban. At the time, beekeepers were experiencing mysterious die-offs. Bonmatin proved that the neonicotinoids produced by Bayer were to blame. When the results were made public and the beekeepers protested, the company was swift to respond.
Very quickly, Bayer started to exert pressure to get us to keep quiet. They didn't want us beekeepers causing problems. Bayer sued me for libel. I don't produce honey from sunflowers or canola. I was acting in my capacity as head of the National Union of Beekeepers. But they sued me as a private individual. Our lawyer defended us, and we won. And Bayer chose not to appeal the ruling. But I wasn't the only one. The scientists also came under pressure. The aim was to stop the debate so they could carry on making money.
But the French government was also alarmed by the mass bee deaths and had commissioned a study.
Before we even started our research, Bayer began using the Agriculture Ministry to try to impose its methods and threshold values on us. So that wasn't a good start. Then, when we got our results, they came into the lab to check my analysis and find any errors. They were desperate to find a mistake. but I hadn't made any. And because we had proven that the toxins penetrate even the blossoms of the plant, they were forced to accept our results. Later, I mentioned the pressure exerted by Bayer to the French media. I then received 2 letters from a Bayer lawyer, one addressed to me personally, and one to the head of my institute. They wanted to use their influence to force me to keep my mouth shut. They expected me, a scientist, to hide my results in order to protect Bayer's sales.
But that wasn't his first brush with Bayer. Jean-Marc Bonmatin works for one of the top research institutions in France. It was back in the mid-1990s that he was commissioned by the French Agriculture Ministry to investigate the mass bee deaths. Suspicion had fallen on a neonicotinoid first made by Bayer called imidacloprid. Bonmatin says that at the request of the regional agricultural authorities, Bayer employees were actively involved in the first study.
I believe it's normal for a company like Bayer to be informed if one of its products is being investigated. But what absolutely isn't normal is when representatives of that company whose product is being assessed are involved in determining details of the approach to be taken, including the financing and even the publication of the final results.
There was certainly a lot of money at stake for Bayer. The investigation began. Bees were sent on the one hand to fields of sunflowers treated with neonicotinoids, on the other to untreated fields for control purposes. At least that's what Jean-Marc Bonmatin and his colleagues were told. They were only supposed to analyze the fields containing the Bayer pesticides, but later they realized that the control fields were also contaminated with insecticide.
We scientists complained when we realized that the control fields had been treated with fungicides and other insecticides. It just isn't normal for an experiment at this level. But the management committee for the study ignored our complaints. Instead, the results of this comparative study, which we now know were worthless, were taken as proof that imidacloprid is harmless for bees.
Suddenly, Bayer's insecticides appeared beyond suspicion. Any possibility of a ban had been dismissed, for now at least. But Bonmatin and his colleagues at the Institute then carried out their own study on behalf of the beekeepers. This time, Bayer was not involved, and the results were staggering.
We were able to prove that everything relevant to the bees, whether it was the corn, the sunflowers, pollen, nectar, water, everything was contaminated. And the levels of toxins in the open countryside were so high that they were sufficient to either kill the bees or at least cause grave long-term problems.
In 1999, France then banned the use of neonicotinoids, but initially only for sunflowers. That wasn't enough for the beekeepers. They wanted a blanket ban on all neonicotinoids. So they hired the services of a Paris lawyer, Bernard Faux. He took up the case against Bayer and other manufacturers. Eventually, it went to the Conseil d'État, France's highest court for administrative cases. Faux realized the companies had exploited weaknesses in the licensing systems to get their products on the market.
European directives refer to what's known as the hazard quotient. If this quotient is exceeded, the manufacturer is obliged to carry out a field experiment under realistic conditions to prove that the product is not harmful. We discovered that this control experiment, which was obligatory in order to gain approval, never took place. If the tests had been carried out as European regulations dictate, these products would never have been authorized.
It's in part thanks to Bernard Faux's persistence that France became the first country in the world to ban the use of all neonicotinoids in 2018. In Germany, meanwhile, Bayer continued to earn well from the insecticides. Neonics were used on many different crops as a panacea for all pests. The discoveries in France didn't appear to bother the German authorities, even though beekeepers here complained of heavy losses. Walter Hefeker was, until recently, president of the European Beekeepers Association. He told us of his organization's relief when Germany finally announced a study on the declining bee population, but the relief was short-lived.
We realized that the initiative only began once the threat was perceived of Germany having to adopt the same stance as France.
There was clearly great concern that the insecticides could be banned here too. Was the industry looking to preempt that move? It would appear that that was the reason why Bayer and another neonics maker, Syngenta, took part in the study. Walter Hefeker soon realized something was very wrong.
Every year, there was an annual report, and every year the findings would go through the media. The varroa mite, which causes honeybee deaths, is really terrible. But we found no problems with pesticides. It was like a public relations coup for them. Obviously, we became increasingly critical of how the whole project was structured. With the methods they were using, they wouldn't have found any link between pesticides and honeybee deaths anyway.
Neonics have nothing to do with the mass bee deaths. That was the apparent finding that defined public opinion right up until the disaster in Breisgau in 2008. The industry had put €500,000 into the bee monitoring project.
When you look at how the project was financed, it's pretty obvious. The one who pays the piper calls the tune. The German bee monitoring project was financed almost entirely by the insecticide makers.
The Beekeepers Association walked out of the project in protest. But by this point, questions were also being raised about whether neonicotinoids harm not just bees, but other wildlife too. We've come to Munich's Botanical Gardens, where we meet Spanish toxicologist Francisco Sánchez-Bayo. He conducted a major study on neonics that's attracted global interest.
So when you published your study at the beginning of this year, what was the conclusion?
We found that in the countries where this has been studied, which is mostly European, American, but also countries around the world like Brazil or Japan, 40% of the species of insects are declining. And among those, 1/3 of them are really declining rapidly and they are threatened with extinction.
He too says neonicotinoids play a key role in that trend. And they don't just kill insects, they damage entire ecosystems. Sánchez-Bayo proved that in Japan, where he studied irrigated rice fields over a 2-year period. These ecosystems are home to minute water fleas known as Daphnia, as well as crayfish and Japanese ricefish called medaka. One day, the rice farmers noticed that much of this wildlife was dying, apart from the water fleas. The crayfish were especially hard hit. A laboratory at Chiba University was asked to investigate. The researchers soon found the culprit, the same neonicotinoid that had killed the bees in France.
We nevertheless observed a very curious thing. The medaka that were in the mesocosms treated with imidacloprid were absolutely all, 100% of the fish were contaminated with a protozoan parasite. And of course, we put it down to the fact that imidacloprid, like other neonicotinoids, inhibits the immune system. So it's all species were sensitive to the insecticide, except Daphnia. So that was the unusual thing. So Daphnia was an anomaly. And the unfortunate fact is that this anomaly had been used as the reason to say that this insecticide was safe for the environment, when it was a complete anomaly.
The poison did not kill the tiny water fleas, but it did effectively exterminate much larger species. It weakened their immune system so severely that they were easy prey for parasites. The results were indisputable, or so Sánchez-Bayo thought. But he hadn't reckoned with a former Bayer scientist who had actually helped to develop neonics.
The day I explained the results of the first year mesocosm studies to the whole group and to the faculty, at the end, he just couldn't understand the results himself. And he asked me, so what are you going to do with these results? And I said, well, the first thing I'm going to do is to publish them, because it's something, a novelty. And he really didn't know what to say. He was speechless and said, do you really want to publish it? And I said, yes, I think it's important to let the world know what's happening. But they wanted to keep it secret. They didn't want to publicize something which would be damaging for the company.
The toxicologist says the laboratory then terminated his contract, but he published the results anyway. The events he witnessed indicate that at least one Bayer scientist knew right back in 2004 about the kind of devastation that neonicotinoids can cause in ecosystems. From our research, it's clear that Bayer tried for decades to prevent any kind of universal ban on neonicotinoids. In France, the company sought to intimidate beekeepers and scientists and played a leading role in a questionable study on bee mortality that exonerated the insecticides. In Germany, insecticide makers funded a bee monitoring project. It led to the widespread belief that neonicotinoids had nothing to do with mass bee deaths. And in Japan, it would appear Bayer employees even sought to suppress the publication of a crucial study. Scientists had proven that neonicotinoids were responsible for the collapse of entire ecosystems. So what does Bayer say to all these allegations and research results? We spent weeks trying to communicate with the company and were then denied entry to its premises. Bayer representatives refused to talk to us on camera. Our written questions went unanswered. Instead, the company criticized what it described as unfair treatment by the media and merely sent us this general statement.
Bayer remains convinced that the use of neonicotinoids is safe for humans and the environment, provided they are used responsibly and in accordance with the instructions for use.
Neonicotinoids only kill pests, we're told. Bayer studies claim that not even long-term use is harmful to bees, other insects, or fish. As for the allegation that Bayer employees sought to manipulate other studies, no comment. We returned to Dutch toxicologist Henk Tennekes. He spent years studying these pesticides. During that time, he discovered 2 studies carried out by Bayer, the findings of which are astounding. In one, a Bayer scientist describes the effects of the first neonicotinoid on the nervous system of a species of fly. These effects are described as irreversible.
Imidacloprid is the first highly effective insecticide that works on the principle of almost completely blocking receptors in a way that is virtually irreversible.
One of the Bayer studies was completed in 1991, so 1 year before the product was granted EU-wide approval. When Tennekes confronted Bayer with these studies, he was taken aback by the response.
Bayer now claims that the blocking of the receptors in the nervous system is reversible. So they're contradicting themselves. If the effect is reversible, it depends on the concentration, and so you can define a threshold level. If the blocking is irreversible, you can't define a threshold level, and so the effect is cumulative.
The original Bayer study is key, because if the toxins remain in the nervous system, that can lead to death, even if the insects were only exposed to a small dose. So if Bayer knew that, why did the company take no action?
Imidacloprid alone generates annual turnover of nearly €1 billion. So I think that led them to just claim something so they could keep selling this pesticide. If they had considered the impact this substance has, they would have had to take it off the market.
We also asked the Bayer Group about these studies, carried out by its own scientists. And once again, the company declined to comment. There's enough evidence to prove the dangers of neonics, but authorities have either been slow to respond or taken no action at all. If we take the European Union, for example, a look at how pesticides are authorized is highly revealing. First, the active ingredient is approved for EU-wide usage. The manufacturer can apply in any member state. France was chosen for the first neonicotinoid. But only the manufacturers test the substance for toxicity and environmental impact. The authorities just do the paperwork. In Germany, that's the Federal Office of Consumer Protection and Food Safety, along with 3 other agencies. None of them test the products. So everything depends on studies carried out by the manufacturer. As the European Beekeepers Association points out, it's a system that's all too easy to manipulate.
The manufacturers can intervene at all levels. They even get a say in how any prescribed tests are structured. Up until now, it's also been the case that these studies that a manufacturer commissioned or undertook remained a corporate secret. They couldn't be published. So no one else could tell what the licensing authorities actually checked. That makes life easy for the authorities because no one can really question their decisions. It's a very convenient relationship between industry and regulatory authority.
To this day, it remains a distinctly sickly system. What if independent laboratories were to carry out tests prior to approval, instead of these powerful chemicals companies? We'd like to discuss this with the German Agriculture Minister, Julia Klöckner. For weeks, we tried to get an interview. When we finally got an appointment, we were told that we couldn't use our camera and that the minister had no time for us. Instead, we received a statement saying that the ministry was committed to
continuing to develop the approval and licensing procedures on the basis of the latest developments in science and technology.
And yet, an EU directive aimed at tightening the approval regulations for pesticides has been stalled for years, with Germany among those standing in the way. Critics, like French lawyer Bernard Faure, say it's the result of successful lobbying by manufacturers like Bayer.
Donc, il faut pas être naïf. Ces sociétés-là,
we mustn't be naive. The goal and purpose of these companies is to make money with these products.
Sur ces produits. Donc, il est normal que,
and that's what they do, with all means at their disposal. That's normal.
Leur commerce. Ça, je crois que c'est normal. En revanche, ce qui n'est pas normal,
what isn't normal is breaking the law, concealing facts, and playing for time.
De traîner dans le temps.
In order to prevent products that are harmful from being taken off the market.
Produits dont on sait qu'ils sont nocifs.
Even though the evidence is clear, neonicotinoids are still one of the most widely used insecticides in the world. Bayer, on the one hand, has influenced scientific studies and intimidated and sued its critics, while on the other, lax licensing rules and authorities who have ignored deeply troubling studies have prevented meaningful controls. And meaningful changes will mean companies being monitored more closely and warnings heeded earlier.